glancing at the top 10 highest grossing films of all time, Titanic sticks out in a somewhat unique fashion.
Of the 10 highest grossing films, 8 of them are part of a franchise, 9 if you include Avatar, as it currently has sequels in production. Titanic is the only one of those that is a standalone film and nothing else.
It's easy to forget the impact that Titanic once had, and how it's still being felt to this day.
Titanic, somehow, someway, hit the perfect chord when it came out. Obviously, 2 other films have since outgrossed it, but Titanic's success is the rare kind, I feel. It's a type of film that, if made today, probably wouldn't have done as well as it did.
It ultimately begs the question. In order to try and answer that question, we first have to go back to the beginning.
That might be a bit too far. That's better. After a screening of the 1992 IMAX documentary Titanica, James Cameron sought out funding to pay for an expedition and do the same thing.
This entire thing exists because Cameron just really wanted to see the wreck. How fitting.
He gave a pitch to 20th Century Fox, or 20th Century Studios, I guess, showed this painting and boldly stated, "Imagine Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic." They almost said no. The big concern was the obvious. Would this actually make money?
Hindsight is 20/20.
They ultimately said yes, wanting a long-term relationship with Cameron and given the success of his previous films. Cameron's wish was granted, and he was able to dive to the wreck itself and film it.
Though in Cameron's infinite wisdom, he also damaged the wreck.
Filming the actual wreck of the Titanic led to a great deal of publicity for the film. But it also added an element that is rarely discussed, I feel. To quote the late great Roger Ebert, "The opening footage from the bottom of the Atlantic is eerie in its impact. It gives the film weight and gravity. We look at a real ship that really sank, and we feel like intruders on its ghostly silence. The solemnity of those scenes lends authenticity to everything that follows. In a film constructed out of special effects, Cameron starts with the ultimate reality of the Titanic itself. These shots strike precisely the right note. The ship calls from its grace for its story to be told, and if the story is made of showbiz and hype, smoke and mirrors, well, so was the Titanic." After the scenes involving the actual wreck were shot, Cameron began to write the screenplay.
After that, the long, arduous production began.
Cameron went big for Titanic, as he knew right from the start that this was going to be an expensive film to produce. In his initial pitch, he very clearly stated that this was most likely going to cost more than $100 million to produce. The sheer size of the set itself was something to behold for the cast, crew, and ultimately the audience. Just looking at photos and videos of the thing blows me away. To quote Brendan Hodges, "I have a theory. Older movies with huge sets, huge casts of extras, and in-camera practical effects play better now than they did at release. After years of being inundated with green screen and endless CGI, seeing the bewildering scale of Titanic is even more staggering."
Despite all that, though, Titanic's production was messy.
If you ever wondered why there are 12 years between Titanic and Avatar, it wasn't just for the evolution of visual effects. This was the movie that cemented Cameron as the quote-unquote scariest man in Hollywood.
If he wasn't yelling at you, he was yelling at somebody next to you. And then he was going to yell at you.
He even gained a nickname for his behavior, Midge. There were times when I was genuinely frightened of him. Jim has a temper like you wouldn't believe. When somebody felt a different way on set, there was a confrontation. He lets you know exactly how he feels. Production was supposed to last a total of 138 days, but that quickly grew to 160 days, and cast and crew were getting sick of it all. Some days on set went as long as 20 hours. Kate Winslet was operating on about 4 hours of sleep a night and chipped a bone on her elbow.
Mind you, she went out of her way to ensure she landed this role.
3 stunt people suffered injuries, while many others came away with the flu or kidney infections, spending hours in the cold water. Someone went so far as to poison Cameron with a hallucinogenic drug which sent Bill Paxton and others to the hospital. The budget to start off with was $135 million from 20th Century Fox. Or rather, that's how much they offered to give. Paramount stepped in with $65 million and North American distribution rights, with Fox handling worldwide release.
This meant that Titanic was now officially the most expensive film ever made at a budget of $200 million.
At 195 minutes in length, or 3 hours and 15 minutes, the film was quite literally costing about $1 million per minute. Or rather,
200 million divided by 195 equals to $1,025,641 per minute of screen time.
Fox began to panic and wanted the film trimmed down to something more manageable, like 2 hours to ensure more screenings per day. Cameron fought with Fox, and he was able to have the 3-hour runtime he desired.
Fox tried to fire Cameron, but...
You want to cut my movie? You're going to have to fire me! You want to fire me? You're going to have to kill me!
Despite fighting for his artistic integrity, Cameron himself was having serious doubts about the project.
We labored the last 6 months of Titanic in the absolute knowledge that the studio would lose $100 million. It was a certainty.
It is a mathematical certainty.
There were 20 reasons why the film was going to lose money, and the studios, the two studios involved were utterly convinced that it was really just a question of how many tens of millions of dollars they were going to lose. In post-production, all we could cling to was the possibility that it might actually be a good film.
The film was supposed to be released on July 2nd, 1997, but that got pushed back to December 19th, 1997, in order to work on the special effects some more.
This only gave everyone the impression that the movie, just like the ship, was headed for disaster.
Cameron forfeited his share of whatever profits the movie may have made in order to ensure trust from Fox. He's even reported to have kept a razor blade in the editing suite with the simple instruction of use only if movie sucks.
This great albatross of a motion picture was seriously shaping up to be the next Heaven's Gate.
And the press were having a field day with it all. Every other day, some news story about the movie would make the front page. Toxic garbage was thrown at Cameron on a regular basis, almost hoping this film would be the end for him altogether.
I mentioned earlier how Titanic stuck out from the rest of the top-grossing films by not being part of a franchise. Well, in hindsight, that's a blessing. Back then, that was a death sentence.
Titanic had a lengthy list of things going against it. In an interview with piece of shit Charlie Rose, Cameron explained what the film had going against it.
So I go in and I sit down at 20th Century Fox and I say, okay guys, here's the picture.
Cameron mentions a lot of elements at work here, so I'm going to try and explain why each one mattered the way it did.
It takes place in 1912. It's a period drama.
Pretty self-explanatory. The movie was going to be a period piece. Period pieces can be quite expensive as they require the right costumes, sets, etiquette, and dialogue has to sound of the times.
We can't have any stars because the characters are too young.
This one might be a bit misleading, but remember, this was Cameron pitching the movie. He had no actors yet for these characters. Dicaprio and Winslet were already out of their fresh talent stage of their career and making a big wave in Hollywood as is. They had also both been nominated for Oscars years prior. What Cameron is saying here is that for the characters he had envisioned were quite young, late teens, early 20s, so he couldn't have a huge established star with a box office draw effect.
And it's probably going to cost north of $100 million.
And it was going to be expensive. Before Cameron made Titanic, his last film, True Lies, still not on Blu-ray, was the first film in history to have a budget of $100 million right from the start.
And everybody dies at the end and there's no sequel.
Not only could this film not have any sequel or franchise potential, but it was going to have a depressing ending. And as the wise man George Lucas figured out years before, the happier your ending, the more money your movie will make.
3-hour movie.
And if you make a 3-hour movie, that means that it can't be played but so many times in a theater, and they're not thrilled about that.
Exactly.
The thing with 3-hour movies is that they can only be played about 3 times a day. It's why you only see certain big movies, like Avengers Endgame, being 3 hours, because there was enough anticipation and expected success that they could make that safe bet.
Plus, you can't have a toy line sprung out of it.
Right.
Unless Funko Pops 20 years after the fact count, this wasn't a movie that could have merchandise launched with it.
You can't have an indefinite number of sequels.
No franchise potential of any kind whatsoever, no sequels, no side movies, no character-focused spin-offs, no Netflix anime series. Though the unofficial giant ships cinematic universe of the mid-2000s begs to differ. I think.
Theme park attraction is right out.
I'm seriously trying to imagine a theme park at Disney World that is Titanic-themed. Not a good image. Avatar, Cameron's next film, does have a theme park attraction at Disney World. And from what I hear, it's pretty good. I would like to see it someday.
You go in but you don't come out.
To put it very bluntly, Titanic was essentially a $200 million one-night stand.
So it's a tougher sell. It goes against the grain of Hollywood wisdom to do a picture on this scale in that budget range without all of those things that give them comfort.
So what did they say?
Let us think about this. Yeah.
Not to say Titanic didn't have some things going for it in its favor.
Cameron already had a lengthy good track record with his previous films. He had the skills and clout to get a film like this made, and the success history to boot. Then, of course, there was this guy! DiCaprio was huge in the 90s, and a gigantic teen idol. He was like Timothée Chalamet, but talented, and better looking, and 100 times more popular. Put him in your movie, and it sells itself. Also, how fitting that both DiCaprio and Winslet were both in Shakespeare adaptations in 1996.
There's also the subject matter of the Titanic itself that's rarely discussed.
The Titanic sank in 1912, 2 years before even the First World War. The incident also holds a record, as it is one of the deadliest peace maritime disasters with 1,500 dead. About 60% of those who died in Pearl Harbor, and about half of those who died in 9/11. I juxtapose those two events with Titanic, as this was a tragedy of human error, and not malicious intent. Human hubris pushed to the absolute extreme. They all said,
God himself could not sink this ship.
when in the end, it was an act of God that sunk it.
Then there's the sinking itself.
Another element that is rarely discussed: documentation. Pearl Harbor and 9/11 both have photos and film footage to fill hundreds of documentaries. Titanic has none of that. No photos of what the sinking looked like, all told through the lens of word of mouth. In some ways, the sinking of it is still a great mystery. The wreck itself wasn't discovered until 1985, 73 years after it sank, and everyone was surprised to learn that the ship had broken into 2 pieces.
We're still searching for the stern. We can't find it. It does appear to be disconnected.
There was appeal to the subject matter on a curiosity level, but the track record for success wasn't always there.
Before Cameron's film, there was at least a dozen other major Titanic films, some of which were quite successful, while others simply faded into obscurity. There's Titanic, 1953, which won an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, A Night to Remember, 1958, which is usually considered the best one, but underperformed at the box office, and also had Bernard Fox in a small role.
Well, the boy's a hero then. Good for you, son. Well done.
The Unsinkable Molly Brown in 1964, in which the Titanic didn't have much to do with the movie. SOS Titanic in 1979, a TV movie which had a huge commentary on class, and starred David Warner in a lead role. And, I'm not making this up, Titanic, 1944, a Nazi propaganda film designed to say British engineering is nothing compared to that of Germany.
So when it came to Titanic, you had options, but none of these films had ever performed on the level that Cameron's film was going to.
Given that Cameron's film contained various cast and elements from previous films, that kinda makes his movie the Avengers of Titanic movies? Kinda? After years of prep, months of anticipation, or for some, disappointment, the movie was finally released. In Japan. The film premiered at the Tokyo International Film Festival on November 1st, 1997. Reaction to the film was described as...
It's fine. It's fine. Just fine.
A month and a half later, it premiered in North America on December 14th, 1997.
And everything changed.
Upon release, Titanic received significant critical praise, with many commenting on the technical artistry, the emotionally charged love story, the spectacle of it all, and the film's cultural, historical, and political impacts.
A 101-year-old woman remembers her voyage aboard the doomed ship Titanic in an opening scene from Titanic, which, after all the publicity and all the delays and all the reports about its world record budget, turns out to be a glorious Hollywood epic, wonderfully well crafted and well worth the wait.
Meticulous in detail, yet vast in scope and intent, Titanic is the kind of epic motion picture event that has become a rarity. You don't watch Titanic, you experience it. To describe Titanic as the greatest disaster movie ever made is to sell it short. James Cameron's recreation of the 1912 sinking of the unsinkable liner is one of the most magnificent pieces of serious popular entertainment ever to emanate from Hollywood. Cameron's magnificent Titanic is the first spectacle in years that honestly invites comparison to Gone with the Wind.
Then there was that legendary box office run.
On its opening weekend, Titanic finished in first place and grossed a little over $28 million. Not exactly the splash that Fox and Paramount were looking for.
Little did they know.
Those who did see it on opening weekend began to spread the word. By the second weekend, word of mouth had spread and the film made $35 million. The third weekend, $33 million. By January 4th, it had made $157 million in North American box office. On Saturday, February 14th, 1998, Titanic made $13 million, the most it would make in a single day. The day in question? Valentine's Day.
And then Titanic conquered the world.
Titanic was number one at the box office for a record-setting 15 weeks, a feat no other film in history, past or present, has ever hit. The closest was Beverly Hills Cop at 13 weeks. Additionally, it spent 26 weeks simply placing in the top 10 earners every weekend. It was still playing on 3,200 screens 10 weeks after release. Titanic outgrossed Star Wars and became the top earner in North American box office. George Lucas sent Cameron a personal poster congratulating him. In the worldwide box office, Titanic had done the unthinkable. It surpassed Jurassic Park on February 24th, 1998 to become the highest-grossing film of all time. And by March 1st, 1998, Titanic became the first film in history to hit the $1 billion mark after 74 days in theaters. Titanic finished its run on October 1st, 1998, grossing $1.84 billion worldwide.
A big reason Titanic did so well was not just because, quite literally, everyone saw it, but everyone saw it multiple times.
The normal repeat rate for a blockbuster in the 90s was 5%. Titanic, however, 20%. Fox estimated that 7% of all teenage girls in America had seen the film at least twice by its fifth week. Despite the 3-hour runtime, only allowing 3 showings per day, theater chains began a fourth screening relatively close to midnight. The risk paid off remarkably well as they were rewarded with full houses.
Then came the other major success, the awards run.
On December 18th, 1997, one day before release, Titanic was nominated for 8 Golden Globe Awards. Cameron was surprised by the nominations. This is a new game for me. My films, at least since Aliens, have all been nominated mostly in the technical categories. To be embraced for directing and screenwriting has not happened before, so I don't know what it means. 1 month later, on January 18th, 1998, Titanic won 4 Golden Globe Awards. Best Original Score, Best Original Song, Best Director, and Best Picture Drama.
So, does this prove once and for all that size does matter?
On February 10th, 1998, Titanic tied with All About Eve and scored 14 Oscar nominations for the 70th Academy Awards. Leonardo Dicaprio was not nominated for Best Leading Actor, as many assumed he would have.
Yes, it is. There's one other element that I want to stress, and that's Leonardo DiCaprio. This guy, finally, from Gilbert Grape, which was a transcendent piece of acting.
Yes, it was.
He's come up with another one in a story that, as you say, could have been melodrama. I think he's just absolutely captivating. By comparison, she comes off as flat to me, Kate Winslet. I did think so. He's just great.
Which led to a small protest of about 200 people. One Academy spokesperson said of the protest, the calls did not just come from teenagers. One older woman called and said the entire state of Florida was upset.
And on March 23rd, 1998, Titanic made history once again.
Titanic won a record-tying 11 Academy Awards, the second film in history to do so. The last film to do so was Ben-Hur in 1960. The next film to do so was The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King in 2004. Coincidentally, Bernard Hill was in both Titanic and Return of the King. Cameron's speech upon winning Best Director is seen as both ambitious and infamous.
I'm the king of the world!
Christopher Goodwin said of the moment, "It's hard to forget the director on the stage of the Shrine Auditorium in L.A., exultant, pumping a golden Oscar statuette into the air, shouting, 'I'm the king of the world!' As everyone knew, that was the most famous line in Titanic, exclaimed by Leonardo DiCaprio's character as he leaned into the wind on the prow of the doomed vessel. Cameron's incantation of the line was a giant F off in front of the television audience approaching 1 billion, to all the naysayers, especially those sitting right in front of him. The 70th Academy Awards was also the highest viewed Oscar broadcast in history, garnering more than 57 million viewers in North America alone, all due to the popularity of Titanic.
Even after the major award wins, Titanic's success continued on and on.
On September 1st, 1998, Titanic was released on VHS in a 2-cassette package. In the first 3 months, it sold 25 million units. It went on to sell more than 59 million units worldwide, surpassing The Lion King for more VHS units sold. Kids' films tend to sell better on home media, so the fact that Titanic was able to outsell The Lion King is an achievement in itself.
Titanic then broke another record.
The first DVD of Titanic was released on August 31st, 1999, in a single-disc format. At the time, fewer than 5% of households in North America even had a DVD player. The DVD only contained the movie and the trailer. Despite all that, Titanic became the first movie to sell more than 1 million DVD copies.
The message was crystal clear. People loved Titanic. What exactly was the appeal of Titanic? There have been plenty of successful films before its time, but none have ever performed on a level such as this.
Hell, one could argue no other film since then has performed like this. When adjusted for inflation, Titanic outgrosses everything. From Star Wars to The Sound of Music to E.T. to Dr. Zhivago, the only 2 films that did outgross it are Avatar and Gone with the Wind. Even more impressive, as I explained earlier, is that it didn't have the usual safety net usually associated with a film of this size.
No franchise potential, no merchandise, no rides at Disney World. It was just a movie, and nothing else.
Well, a movie and a multi-platinum hit single that on February 12, 1998, broke the world record with most radio plays in a week at 117 million. You could argue that there aren't many films that were like Titanic before Titanic was even a thing.
It's an anomaly. It defied all odds and all expectations. But could that ever happen again? In order to answer that question, we first need to dissect the type of movie that Titanic is.
According to Wikipedia, Titanic is an epic, romance, disaster film. Those last 2 are pretty clear, but that first one, epic, can be a little tricky to define. Citing Wikipedia once again, epic films are a style of filmmaking with large scale, sweeping scope, and above all else, spectacle. Typically having dozens of major characters, a period setting, lavish costumes, sweeping musical score, and shooting on historic locations. Epic films are usually incredibly expensive to make, but usually end up turning in a huge profit. They also tend to run close to or over the 3-hour runtime. D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation is often considered to be one of the first major epics.
Epics aren't limited to just historical fiction.
Cameron's next film, Avatar, fits under the category of science fiction epic. The 10 Commandments is a religious epic, while the Lord of the Rings trilogy is a fantasy epic. There are 2 noteworthy films that Titanic can be compared to, Gone with the Wind and Dr. Zhivago. All 3 of those films are highly successful, non-franchise, high-budgeted, adult-oriented, romantic, historical epics. Those 3 are all in the top 10 highest-grossing films when adjusted for inflation.
Glancing at those dates, there's about 20 to 30 years between those movies, and each one came at a major milestone in entertainment.
Gone with the Wind was released during the now-dubbed Golden Age of Hollywood and was in full color. The movie was such an event that kids were able to get out of school and watch it. That doesn't happen anymore, to say the least. Dr. Zhivago was released during what's referred to as the Golden Age of Epics, that was the 50s and 60s. Films like The Bridge of the River Kwai, Ben-Hur, Spartacus, Lawrence of Arabia, and The Sound of Music.
It's interesting to see how epics have evolved since the release of Titanic.
In 2001, we got Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor. By no stretch of the imagination is this film good. It's horribly inaccurate, offensive, far too long, and clearly a movie Michael Bay has no interest in making. There were many films that tried to capitalize on the success of Titanic, and Pearl Harbor is the go-to example that people point to the most.
And it's easy to see why. Pearl Harbor makes no attempt to try to hide the fact that they're clearly just trying to recapture Titanic's success.
A huge milestone event in history that shaped the world forever, told through the lens of a love story.
Now that I think about it, that actually describes a lot of movies.
It certainly made money, but not Titanic money. As to what went wrong, do I really need to answer that?
No.
Patrick H. Willems, in a 2-part essay on Michael Bay, described Pearl Harbor as,
"What if Titanic, but we win at the end?"
And that's about as accurate as it's going to get.
It was a serious attempt to replicate Titanic's success that didn't pan out in the slightest. Though if it were successful, it does make me wonder what sort of impact it would have had. Would the epic genre have thrived longer? Would Josh Hartnett have been a bigger movie star? Would Kate Beckinsale not become an action icon? Okay. Would Michael Bay have... who am I kidding? He would still be Michael Bay.
Though in recent years, the epic has been watered down, for lack of a better term.
In 2017, we got Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, and it was fantastic. Might just be one of his best films, and arguably the right amount of Nolan. Though there was something about it that felt ever so... gimmicky. Was it the non-linear approach? The minimalist style? The bad sound mixing! Despite all that, Dunkirk still fits the category of epic. Huge historical event, thousands of extras, shooting on actual locations where the event took place, and it doesn't even clock in at 2 hours. Then in 2019, we got 1917, and the gimmicky nature of that movie was cranked up to 11. The entire film is made to look like it's one giant long take. Kinda like... Birdman. I do like 1917 a lot, but the whole one long take thing seemed a bit artificial. Not in the sense that it looked bad, but it felt distracting more than anything. Just like Dunkirk, it fits the usual checklist of the epic, but had to rely on a gimmick more than anything. And it also clocks in under 2 hours. Genre is always a fascinating subject to explore when it comes to understanding the success of a movie. To go back to my original question,
could Titanic happen again? It's important to talk about the media landscape that Titanic came out of.
1997 was not too long ago, but the way we consume media could not be more different. Back then, you didn't have as many options as you did now. You went to the movies, you watched TV with your favorite show playing once a week, and you played video games. There was no Netflix, no Amazon Prime, and no Disney Plus. There was no YouTube, and internet culture was in its infancy. Your options for entertainment were quite limited, but there was usually an audience for it. If you were watching something, odds are everyone else was too.
You were either watching Seinfeld, or you weren't. Or in this case, you either watched Titanic or you didn't.
Even worse, if you missed an episode, you were out of the loop, and unless they reran it, that was it. And then John from accounting shows up and talks about America's Funniest Home Videos when no one else watches it. God damn it, John, no one watches AFV!
But that's what it was like back then.
Everyone more or less had access to the same options. Odds are you could find someone, or an entire collection of people, all watching the same thing you were. Movies worked in similar fashion, except we didn't have a choice in formats like IMAX or AVX or even 3D. Every now and then, you had a movie in 3D, and it was as gimmicky as you could imagine. No Netflix originals either, for that matter.
Titanic is what is often referred to as an event film.
Like the epic genre, event films can be a little tricky to define. In many cases, they are typically blockbuster films, large budgets, effects heavy, and a great deal of anticipation surrounding them. Event films typically filled out the summer season as that was the most lucrative time for release. This is why so many assumed Titanic would fail. A movie that size releasing around Christmas time was considered a death sentence. Because Titanic had become such a media frenzy before release, and due to it becoming the most expensive film ever made, event film was putting it mildly, though it was released the same weekend as the current James Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies. Wonder which executive got fired for that decision. One of the main reasons Titanic stayed #1 at the box office for 15 weeks straight was due to a lack of obstacles after its release. Early 1998 wasn't filled with many event films that could slow Titanic's success down. Even another DiCaprio-led film, The Man in the Iron Mask, couldn't do much to stop it. Audiences just kept coming back to Titanic again and again.
As they say, timing is everything.
Titanic came out in 1997, 2 years before Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, 5 years before Spider-Man, and 11 years before Iron Man. Not to say there weren't any big IP-driven films in the 90s, but you look at many of the highest-grossing or Oscar-winning films of that decade, most of them were historical epics/dramas. Dances with Wolves, Schindler's List, Braveheart, Apollo 13, Sense and Sensibility, Amistad, Saving Private Ryan, just to name a few.
There was once a time when movies like these ruled Hollywood, and everyone saw them.
It's hard to say when things began to shift to more franchise, IP-driven. Maybe it was The Phantom Menace, I don't know. The point being is that if Titanic came out just before Hollywood became more reliant on franchises and exploitable fan bases for profit, it probably wouldn't have become the hit that it was.
There's also the nature of Titanic being a very effects-heavy film.
I'm willing to bet if Titanic was made even just a few years later, it not only wouldn't have been the hit that it was, it would have relied on CGI more than it did. CGI was making huge progressions in the 90s, but it wasn't quite there yet. There's a great deal of CGI in the film, from the ship itself to actual people in several shots. But they still pretty much built the ship for the movie, then sunk it in a tank of water. I could seriously see just one section being made and having it be repurposed again and again to give the illusion that it was the ship in full. The staggering scale of Titanic's sets meant that the best way to experience it was in the theater. Watching this movie on a TV at home is not exactly the same.
Which brings us to the home media market in 1997. Or 1998, rather.
Titanic was released on VHS on September 1st, 1998, almost a year after its initial release, while it was still making money in theaters. But that was just it. If you somehow missed a movie in theaters, it could be well over 6 months after the fact before you could see it on your own terms. And because DVD wasn't quite there yet, you were stuck with VHS, and if it wasn't the widescreen version, oy vey.
I might have skimmed and oversimplified some crucial aspects of the late 90s, but the point is, it was a much different time, and how we consume media could not be more different than what it is today.
To summarize as best as I can, when a piece of media came out and had an impact, you just felt it. It had plenty of room to breathe with little fear of it being overshadowed by something else just a few weeks later. Audiences had fewer options, but it meant everyone was more or less talking about the same thing. That creates a conversation.
That creates a cultural impact.
For this section, I'm going to divide it into two, pre-COVID and post-COVID. As of making this video, COVID-19 is still very much a thing, and any information I present in this video is subject to change. We live in a very weird era of entertainment. In some ways, we have too much media and not enough time. Our options are endless. Sure, we still have movies, TV, and video games, but then that gets divided into dozens of little categories. You still have, hey, what's on TV? But then you have Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, Crave TV, Crunchyroll, Apple TV Plus, Curiosity Stream, just to name a few.
That's not even getting into streaming services that just straight up aren't available in Canada, like Hulu, HBO Max, Paramount Plus.
It just becomes endless hours of content that no one can feasibly watch all at once. Not to mention how expensive it would be to own all these services in addition to everything else. Odds are you're going to stick to maybe 2 or 3 of these services, and you're probably not going to watch everything that gets put on there. This does lead to a more diverse range of content from a variety of different voices. It doesn't matter how niche something is, it will find its audience somewhere. The fact that something like Stranger Things, or The Boys, or The Mandalorian can have such an impact, despite being exclusive to specific services, is telling. But if you didn't have these services, what are you supposed to do? And better yet, where does something like Titanic fit into that model?
At my last job, me and a co-worker were the only ones who were watching WandaVision. I had no one else to talk to about this show with in person.
It was lonely. Water cooler conversations have effectively shifted from, hey, what did you think of that episode of Friends, to, hey, there's this really good show called The Queen's Gambit. You might like it. For anything to really have a cultural impact, it has to hit everyone. That's why Titanic had such an impact, because everyone saw it and talked about it up the wazoo. But now, because conversations on media are more segregated, very few things penetrate the public consciousness like they once did. When's the last time a movie or TV show had a major impact that lasted more than a week?
Frozen? Get Out? The Last Jedi?
I recall when Stranger Things came out. I didn't begin to watch it until a good month after release. I kept hearing everyone at my summer program gushing about it. I watched it, and it was great. Cut to summer of 2019 when Season 3 dropped. Everyone at my then job was hyped as can be. It released, we all talked about it, then after a week and a half, nothing. It's changed all our viewing habits. We just consume it as quick as we can, and then move on to the next thing. It's one of the things I love about Disney Plus's approach. It's 1 episode a week, and it's honestly the best thing they could have done. It builds anticipation and interest, and keeps conversation going. Look at the conversations WandaVision was creating pretty much overnight. That would never happen with the Netflix distribution model. Amazon Prime tried this with Season 2 of The Boys, and people lost their minds over it. It got to the point where fans of the show were review bombing it.
But that's just television. When it comes to movies, oh man.
The top grossing films of the last decade have either been sequels or part of a franchise. Big budget original films are basically dead. I'm trying to remember the last time I saw a big budget original film in theaters outside the usual suspects like Nolan or Spielberg. Tomorrowland? Ugh. Do I need to be reminded of that one? Hell, most of the mid-budget director-driven films either get put on streaming or are made by A24. Filmmakers are pained by this. David Fincher, while promoting Mank, said of it, "Unless you're making a tentpole that has a Happy Meal component to it, no one's interested." Or even just a few years back when Martin Scorsese proclaimed that Marvel movies aren't cinema.
The fact that something like The Irishman could cost anywhere between $150 million to $250 million and be a Netflix-only film is fascinating and shows just how far we've drifted.
I'd imagine Scorsese's frustrations came about due to Netflix not only being the only ones who would support that type of film, but actually pay for the darn thing in the first place. Of course, that just opens up the usual conversation about whether or not streaming service movies should be considered for Oscars. And frankly, that always leads to the same 5 or 6 talking points, and nothing else.
And while it's more of a me thing, I always have trouble watching a movie via streaming, whether it be new or old.
Maybe it's my short attention span, but I always felt distracted watching movies at home, even if it's a movie I love, or I've seen multiple times. I was so thankful that I was able to watch The Irishman in an actual theater. Despite all the attention the movie was getting, most of it having nothing to do with the actual movie, conversation vanished in a matter of weeks, I want to say?
This is the first time I've thought about The Irishman since I watched the damn thing.
Lord knows if Titanic was made today, if it would even be shown in a theater, and how long conversation on that would have lasted. And then you have the movie theaters themselves. If you're not watching the latest Marvel, Star Wars, Jurassic Park, Fast and Furious, or DC film, what are you watching? Okay, slight over-exaggeration, but because we're so dominated by franchise films coming out every few weeks, it's easy to feel like it's all just the same.
But that's just it. It all feels the same because we are hit with it so fast.
It's like the 2-minute date in How I Met Your Mother. I remember a time when it was a big event when you got even one superhero film every few years. Now with the MCU, DC, whatever the hell Sony is doing, you end up getting like 10 a year. Marvel themselves can pump out like 3 of these things per year, and conversation dries up before the opening weekend is even over.
2020 was the first year without an MCU film since 2009. And it was kind of refreshing.
In 2019, we had Captain Marvel, Avengers Endgame, and Spider-Man Far From Home. All 3 of those films grossed well over $1 billion. Endgame went on to become the biggest film of all time. Until it wasn't.
Aside from the non-conversation that Captain Marvel was generating, have you ever thought about any of these films in any way, shape, or form since their release? I haven't.
And better yet, how would Titanic have fit into that equation? Endgame was certainly talked about much longer, until conversation quickly turned into how much money will it make? This might seem hypocritical considering how much I spent talking about Titanic's box office earlier, but I always find it weird when people treat it like the be-all, end-all. Unless you're a stockholder or Scott Mendelsohn, why does it matter to you? Box office was also a much different beast. Titanic was a slow burn at making money, what's often referred to as having legs. The average big movie has a huge opening weekend, then teeters out over the next few weeks. Occasionally you get a movie that ends up being leggier due to strong word of mouth, like The Greatest Showman or Knives Out, but those are far and few between. If a movie doesn't make its production budget back on the first weekend of release, it's just expected to be a financial disaster, as typically they make 50% less every weekend. To put this in perspective, Avengers Endgame spent 3 weeks as #1 at the box office compared to Titanic's 15 weeks. Add on the fact that films are basically ripped out of theaters after mere months, weeks at most, in order to make room for the next big thing. Everything just moves at lightning pace, and conversation is never allowed to happen, because now we got this new thing to watch and talk about. Then comes the next thing.
Franchise films have turned into obligations rather than entertainment.
It's no longer, I watched that movie because I wanted to, it's now, I watched that movie because I have to. That's not to say box office is the only factor when measuring a film's impact. A film like Spider-Verse, the lowest grossing Spider-Man film, has arguably made a bigger splash than most, if not all, of the MCU. Or another film like Get Out, which had a huge impact and a very strong commentary that wasn't exactly a huge earner, but generated more conversation than most films in 2017.
Before COVID, entertainment was still in flux, but only sort of starting to settle. But as COVID has progressed, there have been many, many changes. I say post-COVID, but considering COVID is still probably going to be a thing until late this year, who can say?
I took the risk when Tenet came out. Not worth it. But it also showed me just how fragile the theater system really is. It's quite telling how reliant theaters are on the usual Marvel release to keep things going. In late 2020, Warner Brothers made the huge announcement that their entire 2021 slate would be released on HBO Max and theaters. Reaction to this announcement was mixed to negative. Warner Brothers didn't bother telling any of the filmmakers themselves that their films would be affected by this. Christopher Nolan was especially angered by this, and said the following: "Some of our industry's biggest filmmakers and most important movie stars went to bed the night before thinking they were working for the greatest movie studio, and woke up to find out they were working for the worst streaming service."
A lot has been said on this subject. Most of it really dumb.
Some American friends I've spoken to about this didn't seem bothered by this in the slightest, so much as they could get their content and could eat it too. Film critic Matt Zoller Seitz said of the discourse, "Among other things, the HBO Max discourse is proof that the general public hates filmmakers as much as they hate every other kind of artist. I mentioned in my Star Wars video that studio branding and franchise culture has turned directors into nothing more than a vessel to get content made. With this announcement, Warner Brothers has turned their entire 2021 slate of movies, some of which I was quite excited for, into a big catalog of content."
Lord only has to wonder how Titanic would have been affected by this. Would it even have been made at all at this point?
And that's the real tragedy when it comes to entertainment in the modern day. It's now content for something else, an item on a spreadsheet, and nothing more. And because we have so much media at our fingertips, it makes the act of watching something, engaging, being emotionally invested, a case of consumption over anything else.
I'm willing to wager that COVID has just accelerated changes that were probably going to happen in the next few years anyways.
Before COVID took hold, we were already entering the streaming wars with everyone launching their big service. But now they are forced to duke it out when they don't even have their pants on yet. The push for streaming to become the dominant platform for film and television has never been greater than in 2020 and 2021. How much longer until movie theaters are obsolete? Sure, you will still get the big movies like Marvel, Jurassic Park, and Star Wars, but if the only kind of movie that can get a wide release is the usual large franchise film, well, you can already do the math on what that means for smaller, more art house cinema. And there is no way a movie on streaming will ever hit the same way a movie in theaters will.
It doesn't help that streaming services rarely release any sort of hard data on how well their movies or their television do.
It's a closely guarded secret, but that's also the advantage of a movie being released on streaming. Once it's there, with no worry of fighting for screens or if the thing will even make money. Even more so than ever, our entertainment is now content for the conglomerates. Martin Scorsese said recently, "The art of cinema is being systematically devalued, sidelined, demanded, and reduced to its lowest common denominator due to the naming of films as content."
That's all it is at the end of the day, folks. Content.
So much content at our disposal and only so much time to spend on it all. And that right there is the real currency in all of this. Time. Time to watch what you want, when you want, and time to talk about it. Titanic would have been forgotten about in a matter of days in this post-COVID world. Has it dawned on anyone that The Rise of Skywalker was the last $1 billion earner, and could very well be the last?
Is the entire hope for high-grossing movies seriously sitting on his shoulders?
James Cameron does what James Cameron does because James Cameron is James Cameron.
And then there's the great albatross in the room, the internet. Lord knows I could spend half this video talking about the internet and the effect it has on discussion of media, but I will try to summarize the main talking points. The internet as a whole changed how we talk about media and how we interact with it. Cultural impact is almost defined by how many memes a movie can generate.
Does that mean Shrek is the most culturally impactful film of the 21st century?
Somebody once told me the world is gonna roll me.
Why is the answer to that question yes?
Now that's obviously oversimplifying it, but there's probably a grain of truth to that. But that's just meme culture as a whole. Take something that had a meaning and just remove the meaning from it altogether, I think. It's funny to me how the most culturally relevant thing the Marvel movies have done is provide endless ammo for memes. I think it might have peaked with Infinity War, where just about every line of dialogue Thanos said became a meme.
This universe is finite, its resources finite. If life is left unchecked, life will cease to exist.
Internet discourse over movies and TV has certainly made things faster, but not exactly better.
I finally got on the internet, and it seemed to me from what I'd heard that the internet was going to be millions of people all over the world engaged in this uplifting discourse. And as nearly as I could tell, in some of the youth groups that I went to, it basically consisted of hundreds and hundreds of undergraduates telling each other that they sucked.
Everything becomes a game of reducing a movie to nothing more than the barest of bullet points and nothing else. A single statement or even just a single word. Bad. It's part of the reason Rotten Tomatoes is so popular. They've been reducing movies to nothing more than a number for the last 20 years. Lord knows I'm guilty of over-relying on Rotten Tomatoes for my movie selections. No wonder so many were against it back in 2017. Siskel and Ebert did it first by reducing a movie to a simple hand gesture. Lord knows, much has been talked about with regards to the impact Siskel and Ebert have left on the simplification of film criticism, but it's still being felt to this day.
So what would have to be done in order for Titanic to happen again?
Ironically, the only guy who has enough clout to make a film on this scale is James Cameron, and odds are he's going to spend the rest of his career making Avatar sequels, and I am all for it. Anyone who seriously doubts that these movies will be successful might want to get their eyes checked. This has happened with every James Cameron film. So the only other director that can make a film on this scale would be someone like Christopher Nolan, Steven Spielberg, George Miller, Ridley Scott, and even Michael Bay, I'd argue.
But therein lies the issue.
The specific directors needed to make a film on this scale are now stuck making sequels and prequels to films of their heyday. Ridley Scott wants to keep making Alien films. George Miller wants to keep making Mad Max films.
It's why I'm not surprised Spielberg said no to directing Indiana Jones 5.
If that film ends up being successful, and it probably will be, what's to stop him from making any other sequel to one of his other movies? And then there's the studio system itself. Back when Titanic was made, there were 6 major studios: Universal, Paramount, Warner Brothers, Disney, Sony, and 20th Century Fox. Now we are down to 5. 20th Century Fox, now called 20th Century Studios, was swallowed whole by Disney. MGM recently announced that they went bankrupt and were exploring a sale.
How long until the James Bond films are on Disney+?
I know it's cliche to say everything is a sequel, remake, reboot, but it's kinda true. Let's reframe it slightly. Everything big that gets made has a built-in audience. It's a fitting extension to the theater systems being as fragile as they are. The studio system is in some ways even more fragile. It makes me wonder how long superhero movies will remain popular. Not that the MCU couldn't afford a financial failure. They very well could, but imagine multiple ones in a row.
But that's the reality of show business and Hollywood at the end of the day. Nothing is ever certain or guaranteed. So with all that I've discussed over the last, 45 minutes I want to say, could Titanic happen again? Well,
putting all the factors together, factoring in genre, year, money, and the modern age of media consumption, I do think it is a possibility, if highly unlikely for a long time to come. But it's the same way films like Jaws, Star Wars, Raiders of the Lost Ark, or even Toy Story can never happen again.
It's what makes them historically and culturally significant.
If the success of any film could be easily replicated, then whatever impact they had would be non-existent. And not to pick on the MCU more than I already have, but it does make me wonder what sort of long-lasting impact it will have. It certainly changed how franchises operated, but with every film for the most part doing crazy well box office-wise and generally well received, the individual impact on each film is lost.
It's what I like to call artificial impact.
They can be successful, people like them, but they don't stick around for much longer than a couple weeks at most. Even after 15 years, Titanic's popularity never faltered. When it was re-released back in April of 2012, the 100th anniversary of the ship itself, it went on to gross more than $340 million. This pushed its box office to well past $2.1 billion and made Cameron the first filmmaker to have 2 films gross $2 billion.
15 years of jokes, memes, backlash, bad faith criticism. 15 years of debating whether or not Jack could have fit on the door with Rose and then they could have both survived and... Okay, stop.
When I first heard this nonsense, I laughed. What is it with certain big movies that have this one dumb thing that people debate on for years and years? Maybe if y'all just watched the damn movie and paid attention to this moment here, you'd stop bringing up this crap. I guess if there's one aspect of Titanic that'll never go away, it's the popular backlash.
Titanic became one of those movies that suffered massive backlash a few years after it was released. Most of it was really stupid.
This happens to just about every popular movie ever made now. Even after like a week, the discourse turns into, well, that movie wasn't very good, now was it? Titanic wasn't the first film for this to happen to. You can point to Star Wars and how some critics, namely John Simon, who despised it and had to appear like the odd man out.
But maybe that's a good thing?
Many great movies over the decades have often been debated, criticized, or had their reputation tarnished due to a variety of reasons. Time has a way of change, and reputations are altered. There's no denying that the impact Titanic has had over the last 20-plus years is still being felt and probably won't be topped for years, if not decades to come.
So putting it all together once again, yes, I think it is possible a movie like Titanic could happen again. It probably just won't happen for a long time to come.
But maybe it won't. And perhaps that's all for the best. It's what makes the film all the more special.